Today we're going to talk about describing your main character / characters in general. The reason that this is so important is to avoid blob character syndrome. Now, this is basically white room syndrome, but with your characters. Generally, people don't mind too much if the character is like a background character and they don't do much. They just like say one line and then disappear. That's fine. But if you have blob character syndrome with your main character or your side characters, or even a character that pops up every once in a while and pokes their head in and goes hi, and is a decently important part of the story. For example, Neville Longbottom in Harry Potter. He is not a main character, but he pops in and long enough that we need to know what he looks like and should know what he looks like. The main issue with this is if you don't describe your characters, you'll have one of two problems. Problem one, they won't have any idea what the character looks like and you'll actually lose your reader. Some readers, if you do not describe your character soon enough, they're just like, this is just this blob in my head and I don't know what they look like, and that bothers them enough that they put down the book. Second, even if they do move on and just say, oh, I'll just imagine them however I want, then later when you describe them, actually, then it's going to pull them out of the book. If they're like, hey, I thought they were a redhead with blue eyes, and then 50 pages later you're like, psych, they are a black woman. They're going to be like, whoa. Why did you mess with the image in my head? So if you're going to have very distinct races and features and all sorts of things that are important to how the character looks, you gotta describe them as soon as you can. As soon as you introduce that character, try to sneak in those descriptions. Now, obviously, don't force it all at once. This is when you get things like the mirror scene where it's like, I brushed my blonde hair and stared at my eyes in the mirror. That's creepy and somewhat narcissistic. So if they're a narcissist, I guess that's great. But otherwise, don't do it. It's cheesy and cliche. However, that does not mean that you should avoid describing them altogether. You can organically fit description within a first meeting. For example, if I was first meeting someone, I might watch how they twirl their hair nervously, and as a result, I will notice the color of their hair. I might look them in the eyes and therefore notice the color of their eyes. If they're wearing some sort of funky costume, I would immediately notice their funky costume. That being said, when describing your main character, it's important to put things in order of what is most important. The most important thing that people are going to notice first is non-human features. If you are describing aliens or fantasy races, you gotta make sure that anything that is non-human based is described first. Why? Because of the fact that automatically we as a reader are going to assume the person is human. Even if you say alien, we're going to assume they look humanoid unless you distinctly tell us they are not humanoid and how they are not humanoid. So if they have non-human features like horns or pointy ears or, I don't know, flames dancing along their skin, all sorts of fun stuff. Point being, if any of those features are the case, you should describe those first. That way we get that out of the way with the reader, and the reader then knows, oh, this is not a human-looking character. And you don't have to worry about that being a confusing element for the rest of the story. Next thing you're going to want to mention is skin color. Now, do this delicately. Do not mention foods. Foods can be incredibly sexualizing and seen as kind of derogatory. Whereas if you use something that's a lot more earthbound, like snow or the bark of a willow tree or something like that, that sounds a lot more elegant and a lot more elevated rather than possibly sexualizing and objectifying. I know that used to be very popular to do like caramel colored skin or like skin as white as milk or things like that, but it's starting to bug people. And as a result, this is something that both people who are of the BIPOC community as well as people of the Caucasian community have agreed that this is something that's bugging us and that the description kind of makes us go, ugh, that's a little weird. And so it feels very not only cliche, but like I said, somewhat sexualizing and off. And so as a result, I would highly recommend that you do describe skin color because it is an important element of who we are and what we look like. But if you are going to describe skin color, try your best to use nature elements that are not food. The next thing I would say is describing eye color. Most people default to whatever eye color they have as what the main character has, which is kind of a funny thing. We default to the same skin color, eye color, hair color, etc. that we have generally. I don't know why that is, but it is a high percentage of people who do that. Or alternatively, if they're like in Ireland, they'll automatically assume they're redheaded and things like that. There are a lot of stereotypes that people fall into if they are not given a character description. So it's important that you describe their hair color, you describe their eye color, and you also describe their body type. Are they tall? Are they short? Are they curvy? Are they big, broad, and muscular? Those are all important factors of defining who they are. For example, Hagrid. He's an absolutely massive, giant man. If we had not been given that description that he was a giant man that barely fit in the doorframe, you might have assumed he was a normal person. And that would have thrown you off to later learn that he was a giant. So it's important that when you introduce the character, you have the character notice things like that, and even if they're not noticing it, you sneak it in. So, good ways to sneak it in now that we've talked about this. With body type, don't mention the exact height and weight unless you're in a doctor's office or they're like a Sherlock Holmes type of person. And don't typically do it about yourself. If you're saying like, all 5'3" of me was shot across the room by this massive force of wind or whatever. Typically, I don't think of myself as 5'3", even though I am. I don't think of myself as 5'3". So unless that's a specific character quirk, I would say typically just say tall, short, average, those kinds of things. And I would typically describe them in comparison to someone else. So for example, in that same description, if the character is being flung across the room and their attacker is massively tall, they might say they looked up at them from the ground. If they stood up, even if they stood up, they would only barely reach their chest. That gives us a good idea of how tall the character is and how tall the villain is, without having to say they are tall and they are short, and also without having to say exact heights. Now, if you're just doing a basic introduction, again, non-human features first, like you could say their horns curled out of their head and intimidated the main character. Or if you're talking about hair, as you noticed with me, a lot of people fidget with their hair or move their hair a lot, or their hair moves on its own. For example, if you have curly hair, even if you're a guy and have shorter curly hair, typically it'll bounce a little bit as you walk and things like that. So those are great ways to slip it in there. You know, his brown curls bounced as he walked down the street. That gives us a description of his hair color and gives us a description of what he's doing. It's a perfect way to succinctly sneak it in. Eye color, like I said, generally people are making eye contact with people or they're looking at things. So you can always go like, they glared at the couch, feeling uncomfortable about sitting down. But instead you just sneak in an eye color. Their green eyes glared at the couch, worried about sitting down. That then sneaks in that eye color without having to feel forceful about putting it in there. And as far as skin color goes, typically I would say a good way of doing this is touch-based. They took their mahogany-hued hand and ran it across the top of the computer. Or alternatively, she was as pale as an aspen, standing in the sunlight as it glittered off of her skin. That makes it so that you know what skin color they have through touch. So try to use the sense that is most relevant to that specific body part to give that description. Alright, next thing is describing clothing. This is not essential, however it can sometimes be fun. If you have a epic ball, you know, you can have beautiful, elegant ball gowns and beautiful, elegant suits, and sometimes they might match colors if they're a couple or something like that. That is not essential, but it can be really fun details to help immerse your reader in that world more, and therefore it's much, much more intriguing. Next thing you can do with clothing to help describe it is through their action, and their actions can actually help define and describe their character too. If they're forever tugging at their sleeves, maybe they're nervous, or maybe they're trying to cover something up on their hand. if they are pulling up their hood to try and hide their face. That gives us an idea that they're secretive through their actions, but it also lets us know they're wearing a hood. You can also help describe your character through mannerisms of speech as well as actions. And sometimes mannerisms of speech can also then be used to describe clothing. If someone's like, ugh, look at that pauper girl wearing red, everyone knows red is out of season, then you know the person is very pompous, they're very posh, they don't believe that anyone belongs here if they can't buy new clothes every time they attend a ball. That gives us a lot about the character and gives us a description of what the other character is wearing at the same time. There are a lot of ways to weave these descriptions together. Last thing I want to reiterate, make sure as soon as you introduce an important character, you give them at least a basic description. Even if you just say they looked kind of like a toad, that gives us a great idea as to what they look like. We might imagine some warts. We might imagine they're a little hunched over. We might imagine that they have a more leathery, gray colored skin. So even just that basic of a description can help us to feel and get an idea of what the character is like. It can also help give us an idea of their backstory. For example, with Hagrid again, he misspells happy birthday on Harry's cake. That tells us that his education is probably not that great, or even if his education was pretty good, he didn't learn a whole lot from it. And we do learn later that Hagrid's schooling was cut off due to being expelled. And so as a result of that, when you look back, you go, oh, hey, he didn't have that great of an education, and that was reflected in the spelling. So just make sure that when you have your characters introduced, you give them an idea of who they are through everything that they do. Their speech, their actions, their clothing, how they look. It really matters to describe your character because that helps immerse us in your world more and helps us get to know your characters better as a reader and therefore want to feel connected with them better. All right. Reminder that we have 2 more contests this year for 2024. We have a first chapter contest due on November 30th, and we have a Cozy Christmas Mystery contest due on December 21st. If you are interested in that, either leave a comment on this video or come to the American Fork Library upstairs and grab an entry form. Thanks. Bye.